as long as it's not usurped, you can pray upon that land. But then why, O Allah, are you saying that pray upon the maqam of Nabi Ibrahim? Because that spot itself in place, in location, in makan is a wasila towards Allah. Now, if we have a hadith which says that the du'as under the qubba of Sayyidul Shuhada are accepted, does this hadith contradict the Quran or does it not contradict the Quran? Because the Quran is showing that a place can be a wasila as well. But when you look further than that, you find the second example is that Allah, He says, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ فِي لَيْلَةِ الْقَدْرِ وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ خَيْرٌ مِّنْ أَلْفِ شَهْرٍ. That you say all of time belongs to Allah. But Allah is showing that there can be a moment in time that is so great that the ibadat upon one night becomes equivalent to 1,000 months of worship. In other words, that night of Qadr in Zaman and time is a wasila towards Allah. Now, if we have a hadith that says that the one who does the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein on the 15th of Sha'ban, it's as if he has shaken the hands of 124,000 anbiya. Where's the contradiction? So you find this is another example of wasila. The third example of wasila is that when you look in Surah Yusuf, for example, you find that within the story of Yusuf, the story it goes that Yusuf is thrown within the well, he becomes the economic minister of Egypt, and after a number of years, you find the brothers of Yusuf, they come to Yusuf. When they come to Yusuf, at that point the Quran, it says that the Prophet Yaqub, Jacob, had cried so much, وَبْيَدَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ, that he had become blind from crying and from that sorrow. At that point, when the brothers tell Yusuf that, oh Yusuf, that our father is in such a state, Yusuf doesn't say that tell our father to make dua towards Allah. But what Yusuf, he says within the ayat in chapter 12 verse 93, he says, اِذْهَبُوا بِقَمِيسِ هَذَا فَأَلْقُوهُ عَلَى وَجْهِ أَبِي يَأْتِي بَصِيرًا. Take this shirt of mine and place it upon the eyes of my father, and the vision of my father will come back. Over here, the Quran is showing that if an object has the nisbah to a prophet or the son of a prophet, then even that object has barakah and can give shafa. Now, if the hadith says that khak from Karbala is able to give cure towards an individual, where is the contradiction with the Quran? So you find another example of wasila number 3. When we come to the fourth example of wasila from the Quran, you find that the Quran, it says in chapter 2 verse 45 and 44, وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ. That seek help through sabr and seek help through salat. There is no one in the Muslim Ummah who says that Allah said, إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, only we ask for help. And now the verse is saying that you are asking help from salat. In other words, an action is seen as a wasila, and you find that going towards the 6th ayat, before I come to the most conclusive verse, is that when we return to the story of Yusuf, you find that when the brothers of Yusuf, they recognize their mistake, they come towards their father in chapter 12, verse 97 and verse 98, and they say, Ya Abana, istaghfir lana dhunubana inna kunna khati'in. That, oh, our father, may ask for forgiveness for us because we are those who had made mistakes. And then Yaqub, he replies by saying that Sofa astaghfiru lakum rabbi, that I will ask forgiveness for you. In other words, these individuals recognize that we can go to a pious individual or a prophet of God to make dua for us. But when we examine all of the different verses of the Quran, which emphasize the concept of tawassul, you find that the clearest verse of the Quran is that verse which says, Ya ayyuhalladina amanu ittaqullah wabtaghu ilayhi al-wasila. That, O you who believe, have taqwa and seek an intermediary towards Allah. Now some people will say that some who commented on the Quran, they said that this wasila and this intermediary is amal salih and righteous actions, and that is the means to Allah. I say to them, are you going to teach Allah how to reveal the Quran? If Allah wanted to say amal salih, He would have said amal salih. But Allah used a very specific word. He said, seek a wasila. And this ayat is something which is mutlaq. There's no conditions, there is no restriction upon the ayat. Now, if the ayat is mutlaq and it's saying seek a wasila towards Allah, then it's upon us to examine the Quran and to examine the sunnah of the Prophet and see which different forms of wasila do we find in the sunnah of Rasulullah. And when we examine these different forms, you'll find that about 4 of these forms the Muslim Ummah agrees upon, and some of these forms they disagree upon. For example, the first form of wasila that we find in the Quran and the Hadith is that a person does wasila by the asma and the names of Allah. The Quran, it says, Udu'u Allah awidu rahmana ayyamma tad'u falahul asma'ul husna. The Quran is giving a command that call upon the names of Allah. And then you find that there are examples in the Hadith as well. That when we look in our traditions, what is Dua Jashan al-Kabir? We say, Allahumma inni as'aluka bismika ya Allahu ya Rahmanu ya Rahimu ya Karimu. And in that manner we mention name after name. Even when you look in Sahih al-Bukhari, you find that Abdullah ibn Burayda, he narrates a tradition that I heard Rasulullah say, Allahumma inni as'aluka bismika ya Allah al-ahadu samadu alladhi lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. So you find over here that this hadith gives the example that the Rasulullah asked by the names of Allah, and the Quran is mentioned asked by the names of Allah. The names are different than the Zat of Allah. So you find that this first form of tawassul, the entire Muslim Ummah agrees upon this form of tawassul. The second form of tawassul is that a person does tawassul by the Quran. That when we look on the night of Qadr, one of the traditions we have from Ahlul Bayt is that we open the Quran on the night of Qadr and we say, Allahumma inni as'aluka bi kitabika al-munzal wa ma fihi wa fihi ismuka al-akbar. And in that manner you find the dua, it continues that, oh Allah, we are asking through the right of the Quran. And further than that, when you look in Sahih al-Muslim, you find that there is a tradition by Imran ibn al-Husayn quoting from Rasulullah that Rasulullah said, وَاسْأَلُ اللَّهَ تَبَارَكَ وَتَعَالَى بِالْقُرْآنِ. That ask Allah by the Quran قَبْلَ أَن يَجِيَ قَوْمًا يَسْأَلُونَ بِهِ النَّاسِ, before a group of people comes that begins to ask from the people by the Quran. So in other words, the entire Muslim Ummah has agreed that when one has an hajat, that individual can say, oh Allah, I ask by the right of this Quran. Now if there was only a group in history that Allah, He mentioned their name alongside the Quran, and the Prophet said their names alongside the Quran, then there wouldn't be any issue asking by that group. So you find the second example of tawassul that we see within the text is tawassul by the Quran. The third example of tawassul that we see is that an individual can ask Allah by a righteous action. You know, when the Quran, it speaks of Nabi Ibrahim and Nabi Ismail, it says, وَإِذْ يَرْفَعُ إِبْرَاهِيمَ الْقَوَائِدَ مِنَ الْبَيْتِ. That when Ibrahim, he laid the foundations of the Kaaba, him and his son Ismail, after that they made a dua after that amal. The Quran is very specific that when did Ibrahim make that dua? He made that dua after that amal, and he said, رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. Oh Allah, accept this from us. In other words, there are many hadith which mention in both sources, Bukhari and our sources as well, that an individual can ask by an amal. For example, in the story of Ashab al-Kahf, it's quoted that both within our sources in Bukhari as well, that these individuals, after they had woken up, the stone was in front of them and they weren't able to leave the cave. So one of those individuals said, "Oh Allah, there used to be an action that before I would go to sleep, I would give milk towards my parents. And one day, my parents had already fell asleep. So I stood by the side of their bed, and when they woke up, I gave milk towards them, then I went to sleep. And then they said, "Oh Allah, I asked through the right of this amal." It's stated in the hadith that the stone, it begins to move. You know, oftentimes when you look in our majalis, after crying over the musibah of Imam and Hussein, why do we raise our hand in dua? Because we have carried out that amal which gladdens the heart of Janab-e-Zahra, and after that we're asking from Allah. So you find the third form of tawassul. Number one, we had tawassul by the names of Allah. Number two, we had tawassul by the Quran. Number three, we have tawassul by a righteous action. Number four, we can do tawassul by a mu'min when he's alive. This is something which is very clear. The Muslim Ummah, they say to other individuals, make dua for me. The Quran has a verse which says, رَبِّنَا اغْفِرْ لَنَا وَلِي إِخْوَانِنَا. That, oh Allah, forgive us and forgive our brethren as well. And you find this is something which is clear. Number five, you find over here is where the discussion becomes to be a point of contention. When we come to the fifth form of tawassul, now the issue is this, that can you do tawassul by Rasulullah or by a righteous individual after they have passed away? You see, even the Wahhabis will say, as long as Rasulullah is hayy and alive, number one, as long he is hadir and in front of you, and as long as he is able to help you, then it is not shirk to ask by Rasulullah. But now the issue is that when a Rasulullah has passed away, what is the daleel that we can say, "Oh Allah, we are asking by Rasulullah"? You find the first daleel is from the Quran in chapter 4, verse 64. This verse, it says, وَلَوْ أَنَّهُمْ إِذْ ظَلَمُوا أَنفُسَهُمْ. That when these individuals have done something oppressive against themselves, جَاءُوكَ, they should come to you, O Prophet. فَاسْتَغْفِرُ and they should seek istighfar from Allah. Now the verse, it doesn't say just seek istighfar from Allah. After that, the verse, it says, وَاسْتَغْفَرَ لَهُمُ الرَّسُولَ لَوَجَدُ اللَّهَ تَوَّابًا رَحِيمًا. That only when the Prophet does istighfar for them, then they'll find that Allah is merciful. This verse does not have any condition that Rasulullah must be alive. All it says is, number one, the shart is that you go to Rasulullah, ja'uka. Number two, the shart is that you ask istighfar from Allah. And number three, the Prophet of God asks for istighfar for you. So you find this is one daleel. The second daleel is that when you look in the Quran, you find that the Quran shows time and time again that when it comes to the awliya and this dunya, there is a connection. Even if that individual is not a prophet of God. In Surah Yasin, there is the mention of an individual by the name of Habib al-Najjar. Habib al-Najjar was not a prophet, But he was an individual who supported the prophets who were mentioned in Surah Yasin, who were preaching towards the people. And the Quran, it says that after he passes away, he says, Layta qawmi, if only my people saw what Allah has given me of honor and what forgiveness He has given me. This individual who is not a Nabi is thinking of his people after he has passed away. If the Quran is mentioning that Habib al-Najjar is making a dua for his ummah, can Rasulullah not make a dua for his ummah after he's passed away? So you find this is one dalil. But now the question is, okay, you have proven that when one has passed away, they have a connection with this world. But is there any dalil from the Quran or the Hadith that a person who is in this dunya can address a person who is not within this dunya? You find that when you look within the Hadith, there is a narration in Sahih al-Bukhari narrated by Abdullah ibn Umar that Rasulullah is going with Abdullah ibn Umar and he begins to speak to the Shuhada of Badr. And as Rasulullah is speaking to the Shuhada of Badr, Abdullah bin Umar says to him that these people are dead, they can't hear you. Rasulullah replies by saying, Hum asma'a minkum. These individuals, rather they hear more than even you over there. So you find that it's established that even from this world to that there is a connection. But when it comes to the Prophet of God, we have a number of traditions which mention that an individual would make dua by asking through the right of the Prophet. For example, in the Sunnah of Ibn Majah and At-Tirmidhi, the companion by the name of Uthman ibn Hunayfi says that one day an individual came to Rasulullah and Rasulullah said to them, recite this dua where you say, Allahumma inni as'aluka bin nabiyyika Muhammadin wa atawajjahu ilayka bihi. Then you say, oh Allah, I ask you through the right of the Prophet and I turn to you through this Rasulullah, through this Prophet. Uthman bin Hunayf would say that even after the death of Rasulullah, whenever we would have an issue, we would ask through the right of Rasulullah. So you find that there is sufficient example in the ayat of the Quran and the hadith that when it comes to the awliya of Allah, one has the right to ask by them. And there is no greater example of this than the day of Mubahala. That upon the day of Mubahala, when the verse it says, فَقُلْ تَعَالَوْ نَدْعُوا أَبْنَاءَنَا وَأَبْنَاءَكُمْ وَنِسَاءَنَا وَنِسَاءَكُمْ وَأَنفُسَنَا وَأَنفُسَكُمْ. That, O individuals, bring your children, we'll bring our children. And you bring your women, we'll bring our women. And you bring your nafs and yourself, I'll bring my nafs and myself. When Rasulullah came upon that day, in his arm was Imam al-Hussein. And he was holding the hand of Imam al-Hasan. Behind him was Janab al-Zahra, behind her was Amir al-Mu'mineen. You know, there is not a Muslim who says that the dua of Rasulullah will be rejected. Rasulullah doesn't need to do wasila with anyone. The dua of Rasulullah is already accepted. But rather, if Rasulullah wanted to destroy the Christians of Najran with one indication of the finger, he could have done that because it was this finger which split the moon in half. That's why Ayatollah Abul Hasan al-Isfahani would say that Ma al-Kalimu wa ma al-Asa wa ma al-Hajaru. That what is Musa and what is the staff of Musa and that stone which he would strike? When it comes to Rasulullah, fi sababatihi shukk al-qamaru, that within the finger of Rasulullah, the splitting of the moon is there. So Rasulullah, he didn't have to make any other dua. He didn't need a wasila for the Christians of Najran to be destroyed. But upon that day, when he looks towards his Ahlul Bayt, he says, فَإِذَا دَعَوْتُ فَأَمِّنُوا. When I make dua, you say Ameen. I say, Ya Rasulullah, your dua is already accepted. Why do they have to say Ameen? You find that Rasulullah is showing that I, Muhammad, who need no wasila before Allah, if I am using a wasila, then it is these 5 individuals who are that wasila towards Allah. In other words, the day of Mubahala was that day which showed the Muslim Ummah that your pathway towards Allah is through my Ahlul Bayt. And that is why the Quran has given that criteria for who you make a wasila. And upon this night, we remember Imam Hasan and Askari was that extension of that Ahlul Bayt. You know, 2 incidents from the life of Imam al-Askari before I come towards the conclusion. You find that there are 2 very famous incidents in the life of Imam al-Askari. The first famous incident in the life of the Imam is that you find that about the year 260, after the Caliphate of Ma'mun, there were a number of different thoughts and currents which were being spread in the Muslim world. That it was a time period of dialogue. We find the introduction of philosophy at that time. We find the rise of tasawwuf and Sufism at that time. You find people had different beliefs. And amongst the acts which was carried out in the time of Imam al-Askari is that there was a philosopher by the name of Ishaq al-Kindi who wrote a book called At-Tanaqud fil Quran. That this book, it was titled The Contradictions of the Quran. Now this individual was a prominent individual in the court of Banu Abbas, so you can imagine that that book is something which gained great popularity and there was a lot of discussion about it. Imam al-Askari sends one of his companions to go and be the student of Ishaq al-Kindi. Imam al-Askari says to him that when you go to him, don't refute him immediately. Gain the trust of that individual, and after a period of time, then give him the refutation. After a period of time, Imam al-Askari says, go and tell that man, is it possible that what you understood from the Quran is different than what the one who revealed the Quran intended to say? In that one line, when that individual says that line to Ishaq al-Kindi, Ishaq al-Kindi says, tell me immediately who told you this. The companion says, this is my own line. No, he says, this is not your capacity. The one who said this, his capacity is far beyond. At that moment, he says it was Imam Hasan al-Askari. You find the second famous example, before I conclude, from the life of Imam al-Askari, is that the second attack on Islam is that there were a number of people who were influenced by Christianity within that time. The reason is that there was a monk that when he would make dua, the rain would begin to fall. Even imagine today, if there was an individual, when they would raise their hand, dua begins to fall, you would begin to think that there is something towards this person. When one of these incidents had occurred, they call Imam Hasan al-Askari towards that gathering. When Imam al-Askari comes towards that gathering, Imam al-Askari says, go and grab the hand of that individual. They grab the hand of that individual. He says, open his hand. When the hand of that individual was opened, you find that there was a bone within the hand of that man. They say to the Imam, oh Imam, that what is this object? Why did you have us take it? The Imam says that this was the bone of a Nabi and a Prophet. And because he was holding that bone, you find that water, it would come down, and rain, it would begin to fall. Imam al-Askari didn't examine what it was. Imam al-Askari didn't even see what it was. But you find that this is that ilm of imamat, and that ilm of imamat only comes when the imam is a wasila before Allah towards us and from us. towards him. And with that said, I raise my hands in dua and we say, Oh Allah, we ask through the right of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad that wherever the followers of Ahlul Bayt are in difficulty, help them. Wherever they're sick and ailing, cure them. Ya Allah, there are many in this gathering who have hajat, they have difficulties, whether it's family difficulties, whether it's financial difficulties, whether it is with their health, Ya Allah. Through the wasila of Imam al-Askari, help them. And we pray for the hastening of the reappearance of the master of our time. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى
मुमिनीन एक ऐलान समात फरमा लें। साले सवाब की मजलिस है मरहूम सैयद रज़ा काज़मी रिज़वी के लिए फातिमिया इस्लामिक सोसाइटी में नेक्स्ट फ्राइडे को 25 नवंबर एट 7:30 PM। आपसे भरपूर शिरकत की इस्तदा है।
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا رسول الله. السلام عليك يا نبي الله. السلام عليك يا حبيب الله. السلام